Hey, Amber.
Hello.
Give everyone a few minutes to join us. Got another good one for today.
Yeah, I just got this mug. It's little.
Oh, it's so cute.
It has a top cover too. That's just like a big.
That's adorable. I love it. Awesome. I'm gonna share my screen. Maybe we can get started here while folks are joining.
And just like a quick thing for also, oh, Maggie, uh, did you want to do a quick like promo for Observe?
We
Sometimes
have
we
it in
have.
the slide.
Oh, we do. Okay,
Yep,
perfect.
we've got it all set. So we can start with the introductions and we can go to the observe promo here. So hey everyone. Today we'll be covering trustworthy LLMs. This is a survey and a set of guidelines for evaluating your LLMs on this concept of alignment. I'm Sally Ann, I'm a product manager here at Arise, and with me I have Amber. Do a quick intro.
Hi everyone, I'm Amber, an ML growth lead here at Arise, and I do a lot of the community events. If you have any question from today's paper or you want to kind of continue this conversation, you could reach out to us on the Arise community Slack.
Awesome. And I guess that was perfect segue. You want to do the little plug for Observe here?
Yes, awesome. So everyone, if you haven't heard already, we are going to have our Arise Observe in person this year. Previously, they have been virtual, but this will be in San Francisco on July 11th at Shack 15. It's going to be a one-day event focused on LLM observability and evaluation. And we have a special code for our community that's $200 off a standard ticket.
We're super excited. I'm excited. It's the first of the observes that I've been to that's been in person, so it's gonna be a lot of fun.
I think they've actually all been in person, Sally Ann. Yeah,
Uh,
because our first one was still during the pandemic, so it's
oh
the
yes, there's
first
a
in
first one ever.
person. hmm
Very cool. Awesome. Well, let's get into it today. So, our agenda for today, we're going to discuss quickly what aligned versus unaligned models are. We'll go over the taxonomy that's presented in this paper for LLM alignment. We'll give some examples of the evals from the paper, kind of discuss how they're working, what they're evaluating, some of Amber and I's thoughts on them. And then we'll kind of go through like alignment actions. We'll give you our take on alignment, what it means, how to set it up. And then Amber's actually got a really great Phoenix example for us to walk through. So, as always, we love these to be interactive, so please drop your questions in either the QA or the chat. We'll stop in between slides to kind of answer your questions. Um, and with that, we'll get into it. So I think something that's really important in this paper is it talks a lot about this idea of alignment. Amber and I were catching up on this earlier, and we were chatting through kind of what it means to be aligned and where this kind of term came from. Amber, do you want to kind of share your thoughts on what you're kind of seeing with the community on this term here?
Yes, so I feel like it was the beginning of the year. The word alignment started coming up a lot with business use cases, customers, C-suite, like higher up folks at companies that are working on LLMs and just generative AI models and trying to implement this in their workflow. They're now talking about alignment as a key component. Now, you'll see when Sally Ann and I go through the paper and go through our thoughts on alignment, that it's a very broad term and is very just defined by the companies and
Yeah.
defined by the teams. But I first heard the word alignment like several months ago at a conference and was realizing like, oh, this is the actual term people are going by. So if you are writing evals, if you are working on LLM systems, just wanted to kind of do this paper because so many folks are using the term alignment and it's becoming like the biggest, I think, term when we talk about like, oh, are my LLMs working as expected? And that term is just going to be like referred to as alignment.
Totally. So like all the efforts we do with like evals or kind of any prompt iteration, it's really to get our models to be aligned with some given criteria. So here I kind of had some kind of examples of this. So we have like aligned models. That's going to be like ChatGPT. Oftentimes this is like the user facing product that's going to be aligned. It's gone through a certain process to make sure that, it's going to not produce any harmful or toxic content. It's going to minimize bias and stereotypes, try to adhere to the human instructions. That's a big one. And like just ensure that they're acting in a way that aligns with, human values and responsible use. So that's kind of when you think of an aligned model, that's kind of the general idea. As Amber mentioned, this criteria might be different for different applications, but at a high level, you can kind of get the gist of like there's some kind of guidelines that have been put in place, some iteration on the prompt just to make sure that the model is responding in just the right way that we would expect it to. And then there's unaligned models like the early, GPT-3. I remember some early bots. I can't remember the specific ones, but I remember at the beginning of all of this, people would release these LLMs and like within seconds, they would become like toxic because people were kind of prompting them with really like malintent and, they were really unaligned models. They're prone to generating hallucinations, misinformation. They might be perpetuating some harmful stereotypes, definitely susceptible to producing harmful and disruptive content. There could be, they could be easily manipulated by user input, and they just really weren't safe. And they definitely kind of they caused this mistrust. I think, like the public kind of thought that these models were really harmful as a result of us just really not aligning our models with our specific guidelines and requirements. So this is kind of the breakdown. So everything we talk about today is kind of going to be in an effort to align models. So we'll talk about evals, we'll go through the taxonomy, but the idea here is we're trying to align our model with our requirements. So the paper puts forward these 7 kind of criteria, and within them there's kind of like subcategories as well, that you could have that they feel that move models towards alignment. So there's a reliability. So this could be misinformation, hallucination, inconsistency, miscalibration. And so the main idea here is just like anytime the model is generating correct, like we want the model to generate correct and truthful, consistent outputs. That would be like the goal of a reliability eval. Safety is another big one. This is, trying to avoid any unsafe or illegal outputs, leaking private information. Fairness, this is a big one, something that I think we know kind of exists with these LLMs. So we're trying to avoid bias and ensuring there's no, disparate performance. I think like with all of these, something that the paper talks a lot about is like, where do these come from? Like the first, 10 pages of this paper are just kind of talking through like each of these subcategories and how they come to be. And I don't know what your kind of thoughts on this, Amber, were, but I thought it was interesting that, a lot of these are linked back to the training data that are used on the initial training phase. And I think that's interesting because we did a paper a little while back about like the quality of training, and it's interesting to see that we're going through all this effort to kind of mitigate the risk that's introduced through training, where maybe we need to take a different approach there. But love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there's actually I forget the name of the O'Reilly book that talks about fairness, but essentially, there's a chapter on in processing, pre-processing, and post-processing. So this pretty much the steps before the data gets in, the steps where like the model is being trained, and then once you have that model, like looking at the outputs and trying to judge fairness at each part of that, because sometimes you get for these third-party LLMs, you don't have access to the pre-processing or the in-processing. You really are just looking at what these outputs are and trying to evaluate it. So, and that's a way to like mitigate bias and try to stop these models from becoming biased and ultimately try to make them more fair. And yeah, so when you're talking about, oh, it's coming in at the point of the data, that happens a lot, but it's just like it's an interesting process, but like there has to be more that we can do, especially if we're using these models that can reason through things, of not just giving it data and then it's learning this biased behavior, but it's trained on so much information. It shouldn't be like the input data. That's the problem.
Totally. Yeah. It's definitely a multi-step thing, and that's a really interesting comment there of like, checking at every step. That's where like the evals really are going to come into play on that last step there of their outputs. But fairness is definitely an important one. They also have resistance to misuse. So this goes back to, having any cyber attacks, any, malicious kind of inputs to the model. There's explainability and reasoning for the model, basically the ability for the model to actually explain the outputs to its users. You can kind of think of this as sometimes like chain of thought, or with our evals that we use, like our explanations of like why models making an answer on something. We also have social norms. This is about like toxicity, like unawareness, cultural insensitivity. So this is just reflecting, those universally shared human values. And then there's robustness. I think this one's really interesting too. We have an example of this one. So this is just resilience against adversarial attacks and distribution shifts. So it's just kind of making sure your model is robust. But I do think there's some work there on the definition of this one in particular. So this is just their taxonomy. I think something that's worth calling out that we've already kind of alluded to is this is just one taxonomy that you can use. What you want to define as alignment for your model will depend on your use case, what's important to you, what's important to the business. But this is just kind of a general guideline that you can use if you're a little bit unsure on how you should define alignment.
Mhm.
Anything else to add here, Amber?
No, I like that they did list this out. I think if you ask most people what is alignment, especially like for the large LLM providers, they say it's like all the H words, right? We want it to be helpful, not harmful, and let's see, helpful, not harmful, and like not hallucinating. And there's a third one there, but yeah, essentially you want all your things to be helpful, not harmful. And like that's kind of the motto of alignment for a lot of these LLM companies.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. It's kind of like that's your first level, right? And then you kind of define what that actually means. So yeah, that's a good call out there.
Oh, and
I think
Sally, and we got
what's
our first question too.
oh yeah.
Did you want to finish your thought there? And then Rajit's question.
Yeah, we can just go ahead and grab it. It's not showing up for me on my side. If you could just
Okay.
read it
Yeah.
off.
Do you think censoring LLMs would be similar to censoring the internet?
I think it depends, like it depends on what your application is, right? Like if you have a specific application, you're a helpful chatbot that's kind of, maybe let's pretend we're like in some kind of like doctor interface, right? You want to make sure that it's giving true information. You don't want it spewing misinformation. You definitely don't want it to be biased and perpetuating stereotypes. There is a level of censoring that I think is required in certain applications. Now, I don't necessarily think we need to maybe like edit out factual things that happened. I don't think there should be any of that type of censoring. So I think it depends on like how you define censoring and what you're censoring just specifically. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Amber?
Yeah, no, I agree. It kind of it depends, always depends. But for these very large language models that are, take a extremely long amount of time to train, and like the reason we can't just all have a 7 billion parameter model that's as good as GPT-4 to just use when we'd like is that the amount of information these trained on, yeah, there's going to be information in that data that is probably harmful or is biased, but it's not, because it's such a small minority of that overall data set. It's very, very hard to make these models misbehave. And because people just try, like, oh, new
Hmm.
models coming out, like I'm gonna try to do everything I can to make it, be like the Tate, I think it was Tate, the Twitter, the fake Twitter account where it
Yes.
was supposed to be just like a happy, helpful person and AI person, and then they made it kind of be have all these like anti-Semitism and
Yeah.
like just bad thoughts and they were feeding it all these what is it, like all the different like conspiracy theory videos and everything,
Hmm.
and then it was using that to retrain itself. It's
Yeah.
not it's not what it was a year ago or 2 years ago. It's very, very hard to even make a chatbot that's using an OpenAI model frustrated or make it rude, because we've actually tried to create like user frustration evals, rudeness evals, misogynistic evals, and it's very, very difficult. And that's really the difference. Like, right, that's the alignment
Yeah.
aspect.
Exactly. I brought this slide back up because you brought up a great point. Like it's not what it's 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we didn't do any of this. We kind of just were like, wow, this is a really cool model. Look at it responding to things. And I don't think until we kind of released it into the wild, and I don't think any of the researchers who worked on these projects thought like, oh, people are not going to, abuse these systems. And they released them to the wild, and lo and behold, people did. So that's kind of, I think, the motivation behind like where alignment came from is like we kind of observed that behavior and realized that there is this great potential for these systems to be abused. And so nowadays, whenever they release a new model, there are, we have like I think they call them like red data teams at like Anthropic, at OpenAI, that actually spend time trying to make sure that there are proper guardrails in place so that these models can't be abused. So that's a really good call out there, Amber. Okay, cool. Let's maybe take a look at some of the evals that they use here. So they basically have evals for all of these and then some. I just picked a few for us to look at. They're all in the paper. You can see the prompts that they used and the results. But we'll just go through a few of them. I think hallucination is probably by far the most popular eval that is used. We all know that these LLMs have the propensity to hallucinate, create these information or create these statements that are presented as factual, but they're not really. And so what they do is they actually use this kind of indirect eval method, which I thought is really interesting. It's a little bit different than what we usually use. And so what they do is they actually give the LLM a multiple choice question where the options are either a correct answer or a hallucinated answer. And then they basically, how they're doing their evaluation is like if the model selects hallucinated answer, the response is considered to be hallucinated. And so I think this is interesting because you can see here, it's almost evaluating the LLM judge, which we usually kind of think of alignment as um, evaluating the response itself. So I thought this was an interesting approach. You can see the results here, some of those models that are kind of considered to be aligned. They do a better job at picking out the not hallucinated answer, but I don't know about you, Amber, but I just don't feel like this is actually a good eval of a model hallucinating. It seems to me like a good eval for picking out whether a model can decide if something is hallucinated
Yeah.
or not.
And this I just don't really like just like the coin flip aspect, because it's like if for hallucinations, you can have 100% hallucinations, right? But like here, it's kind of like, okay, so if I get 50%, it could just be picking like A each time
Yeah.
for that. So I completely agree.
Yeah, I would love to see them kind of maybe even generate those response pairs or actually kind of build a little bit of an application to test here. But at least it does give a good I'm what I would do if I were looking at these results. I'm like, okay, I'm definitely gonna like kind of maybe go with GPT-4 here if I'm gonna pick an LLM as a judge to do a hallucination eval. That's definitely one insight I can get from this result here.
Yeah. Like Da
Um,
Vinci, I'm like, did it just pick A?
yeah, like
Who knows?
something's off there. I know also for anybody in the audience, I was kind of confused by this access here, refused to answer. That is just meaning that it picked the correct answer there. I thought that access was a little bit confusing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's kind of their take on hallucination. We'll kind of get into a little bit later how we kind of handle maybe hallucination. But this is their take. Another eval that they did was safety. I do think this is another important one. I picked this one because I actually kind of liked their approach. So what they did was they queried LLMs with unsafe prompts to examine whether or not the model would refuse to answer the question. And there was actually some kind of pre-processing, if you will, some generative steps that we had to do to get the data in a good spot. And so what they did was they took like Anthropic's red team data set that they had, and they basically extracted the keywords, and they were able to get this list, and then they used those to generate, the unsafe prompts. So there's some synthetic data set generation going on here. And then they used LLM as a judge to determine whether or not the responses contain any harmful content. So this one's a little bit more aligned with, I think, how like our approach is generally with this. Obviously, we're not using synthetic data sets, we're using real data sets, but here we're actually, using LLM to judge if the response is unsafe or not. So this one seemed to make a little bit more sense to me. Happy to see that pretty much across the board, the models are pretty safe, which I was a little bit surprised by. But yeah, Amber, any thoughts on this one?
No, yeah, I agree that I like the way of which they're conducting this one for safety. And I'd be curious to see more like open source comparisons because that's
Mhm.
what I think a lot of people have questions on now. Like we know at this point it's very difficult to get GPT models to behave poorly.
Yeah.
And but for like Llama 3, I don't see as much about like testing the safety from it, but I would like to see, if it's comparable, because obviously it's a lot cheaper to use Llama 3 and any of the OSS models, because I know we were also talking about like, oh, well, maybe I can fix this a little bit more with fine tuning and other aspects. But yeah, I like it, but just when things get to like 100% or are doing like pretty well, then same with benchmarks. I'll say like, okay, it's time to move the needle. It's time to make something like either a more difficult task or start creating like a larger pool to test.
Yeah, that's a really good call out of like how much can we really trust that 100%. It makes us want to almost evaluate our evals there
Yeah.
a little bit there. But yeah, this I think this format is really powerful. I'm a big fan of, providing, this judge LLM with, the initial task, the answer, and then, prompting it to give some kind of label. Here they're just doing like yes or no, and it's basically you could replace that with like safe or unsafe. But I definitely like their approach here. The last one here, I decided to kind of click on is fairness. So we talked a bit about this, about making sure that our models are behaving fair. In their example here, they did choose only to go with gender stereotypes. So there's a bunch of kind of groups, predefined groups that you could use and test this against. They've chosen just to go with gender. I definitely think that for this to be a comprehensive eval, it needs to evaluate more than just that. But this is just their test. And what they've basically done is they've done some more synthetic data generation where they've looked at specific females stereotypes around, relationships, workplace, schooling, hiring, family. And they just, again, chose the multiple choice. And so again, here, their kind of signal is does the LLM choose to refuse to answer? One of the reasons I chose this was if you look at those results, that's not great. You can see here that like the best results are like 50%. We should definitely, I think, need to invest more in alignment for fairness. Again, it's hard to kind of take these at face value because they've chosen only to use that one dimension of fairness. But I included this just because this is by far, I think, the worst results in their taxonomy. So, Amber, any thoughts on this one here?
Well, there's a paper that's come out that explains the 21 definitions of fairness.
Hmm.
And so obviously fairness is very broad and can be defined
Yeah.
differently, but yeah, sometimes tests on fairness they can kind of because it's so difficult for these LLMs to be biased
Hmm.
just out of the box. You almost have to like either prompt them, like if you want data that's biased, you have to prompt them, like give specific examples of what you want and what bias is to you, like what you want to see in that data. And so sometimes it could be a little bit like set up to fail
Yeah.
for these LLMs. Just because they're so neutral
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's also like a parameter that can be changed. So
Totally. I think it's a really good call out. It kind of talks about making sure you invest in defining what your eval criteria is. And we're going to get into that in the next slide there, but perfect segue. But yeah, so those are just three examples. Really, we wanted to set the scene of what this paper does, the framework and guidelines that they put forth, so we can kind of give you a taste of that and kind of compare it to kind of our take on it. So we're going to go through like alignment, action, and we're going to start with our take here on what it means. So we talked about this at the very beginning, but I think this is probably the single most important piece of all of this, is that you really need to define what alignment means for your application. There isn't a one size fit all when it comes to application. There are those taxonomies, there's these frameworks of things that you should pay attention to. But really, what's most important and what you should evaluate on is going to depend on your application. I was giving the example before of like a patient chatbot for like, doctor's offices. There's going to be certain criteria that you want to make sure it meets. Like you're going to want to make sure it's being factual. You want to make sure it's not spreading any, misinformation. For different businesses, different applications, internal versus external, like those are all things you're going to have to take into consideration to define what alignment is. And this is definitely the first step you want to take, is really taking the time to meet with different stakeholders and understanding what true alignment for your LLM application is going to be. Anything you want to add there? Okay.
Not really. Yeah, that's a great definition, Sally Ann. And I think also whenever we're thinking of our evaluation metrics for our LLMs, like there's so many leaderboards out there, so many benchmark metrics that you can choose from. That's why it's the same with traditional ML models, where it's like, okay, I'm going to start with my use case and then work backwards and figure out like what would actually give me the metrics I need to evaluate that use case. And so similar, for this example, being able to define what alignment means within your org and then decide, okay, do I need traditional metrics like precision and recall, or do I need evaluations for correctness, hallucinations, toxicity, or would it be better for me to make my own eval and define a few key aspects like for myself and create my own kind of prompt template that could do that evaluation?
Totally. And that's a perfect segue to our second point here, is like defining your evals. And we kind of said there were like three-ish kind of things you got to consider with this. So I think like you're talking about is like those first two. It's like the framework and the prompt. So like, are we going to, use like a pre-built, like, you said precision, or are we going to go the eval, like labeling route and then calculate our metrics after that? Are we going to use a prompt that's like provided to us, Phoenix, our open source tool, has evals that we've tested out, but sometimes that doesn't meet all of the needs for alignment. So we often see customers who might use our out of the box hallucination eval, but maybe they have something super specific for their application, so they're going to write a custom eval. So you're definitely going to want to invest in your prompts there whenever you're doing like a custom eval. You're going to kind of apply everything that you do for your LLM prompting to your eval prompting. You want to make sure that it's clear and concise. The LLM has instructions, it's getting the right prompt variables. You want to make sure, there's not kind of room for it to hallucinate or go outside of what it should be responding. So you definitely want to invest in your prompts. And then you got to choose your LLM engine here. So a lot of people might, reach for GPT-4, or maybe they'll use kind of a smaller, cheaper model. You can kind of decide there what's going to work best based off of your, prompt and framework that you're using. Next, very, very important that we have the running and observing eval. So this is what we've defined our alignment. We know what evals we're going to run. Now we actually have to kind of run them against our data to decide like what needs to be done. So you can do this kind of in batch processes, iterative, kind of with like just a data set that's kind of running consistently. There's a lot of different ways that you can go about this. We could probably do a talk just on that, Amber, huh? But at a high level, that's going to be kind of your next step. Anything you want to add to those two?
Yeah, I mean, if folks are interested learning further of any of these topics, Sally Ann and I are happy to do a paper reading, like find a paper that talks about that, and then just really get into the experimental parts of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, like looking at different evals, when we talk about effective ways of doing paper reading, it's not just about understanding what the paper is saying, it's thinking about like, does this apply to me? How can I like, if it's a benchmarking paper, how can I observe this? How can I kind of change it to make it more effective for my own use case?
Totally. Our last kind of point here is like the creation of your golden data set. So it could be called the golden data set. It could be go under a bunch of terms. Really what this is a set of examples. It could be good, it could be bad, depending on what you're going to do with it, which we'll talk in our last point about. But you're going to really leverage these results from your evals to pretty much take action. So we've run our evals, now we're gathering a data set, and we feel like there's two options here. The paper focuses on on fine tuning. They say, you can use your evals from your alignment to then go ahead and fine tune your model so that it is aligned. Amber and I were catching up and we're like, you could definitely fine tune with your data set, but there's definitely an opportunity for prompt engineering here as well. I think we see a lot of customers and people in the community actually starting with prompt engineering. Fine tuning can be a little bit more costly. It's kind of still newish in the sense of, I feel like in the last few months people are actually looking at it for alignment, for performance. Previously it was a little bit more for like fine-tuned tasks or like stylizing the responses, but I feel like it's getting more traction for alignment now. But I definitely think like starting with prompt engineering might be a good idea. So kind of some notes that we put together were like, fine tuning with generated data does lead to improved performance based off of the paper that we read today, but prompt engineering realistically can yield same or better results than fine tuning. It's really kind of leveraging your eval results to identify where your prompt needs work. And so you can kind of leverage those evals to be like, oh, with explanations specifically, you get an idea of exactly why the response was given, and you can, adjust your prompt specifically. Like if you were thinking about something as simple as like robustness, like you can just kind of fix your prompt a little bit to make sure that it's, concise and kind of repeat this process until you get the results. Amber, anything you want to add here before we jump into your example?
Also we say fine tuning and prompt engineering, and then obviously a large use case for the systems that Sail Ann is helping to build, that we see a lot with our customers, our RAG systems as well. And Sail Ann, I believe there is, you mentioned like, so there's part of this paper that talks about alignment and RAG systems and kind of like a correlation there.
Yeah, let me see if I can actually, let me pull up the paper quick here. Um, let me see where it is. I think it's on this page here. Um,
10, maybe.
is it 10? Basically the high level point here is they talk about retrieval augmented generation RAG systems, and they make a call out that aligned models are actually have like basically lower capacity for taking that kind of injected context and altering their knowledge. Where they found that unaligned models were better at this. So I thought that was really interesting to me. And my first note, I wrote it down in my copy of it, and I said, like, what does this mean for RAG? Does this mean that you actually might not want like a ton of alignment? Maybe you don't want to fine tune for RAG. Maybe that's definitely an example for prompt engineering, but yeah, I just thought that was super interesting, and I actually would love to see some more research on that and what that really means for that application.
Yeah, because I think the more essentially like the more alignment you get with your models, the more safe they are. But depending on what documents you're providing your RAG, like if some of the things, I'm trying to think of a good example, because a lot of RAG has been used in like chatbots and copilots, and it's great for those because it needs to leverage very specific information for what it's going through. But maybe if you have a RAG system that's like, based on all these political debates, classify this and kind of answer my questions about this. And if you're feeding into a RAG system things that are a little bit more subjective or could have
Hmm.
nuances to them, I can see it being difficult when you interact with like a chatbot of, like, oh, like, you know, what's the answer to this? Or like, and then the LLM essentially trying to make the answer less either provocative or less opinionated, trying to just like make it overall more objective in its response. But that might not be the actual answer.
Mhm.
And might not be like what really happened like in the conversation of that debate.
Totally. And just a call out here. This is relating specifically to misinformation that they make this comment is on page 10 here where they find it. But yeah, I'd love to see more examples of this. And I think you and I were even having this debate of like RAG versus fine tuning. And I feel like a lot of people are having that debate right now of like what's the right approach. I think it depends. That's kind of my take on it of where you want to use what. But yeah, this was one of the most fascinating things, honestly, to me. This entire paper was just like, wait, what does that mean for RAG?
Wait, what? Like just like one sentence
Yeah,
that makes you do a double take.
literally, that's what it was. I always know when I make a comment, like write it out that it's something that stuck with me. But yeah, do you want to share screen and kind of walk through what
Yeah.
you've done with Phoenix?
Yeah, absolutely. And it will be interesting to see more of the fine-tuning use cases
Yeah.
once we have more open source models and ways to train it. Because for like the audience, like Sally Ann and I were also just talking about how you really don't have to use anything besides these large third-party LLMs for a task like summarization or content creation because they are very good. The problem is that they are expensive, and especially if you're just using it for like a single task and you're using it like once a week, it may or may not be profitable. Like you just might not be making enough money on that task, like for your company, based on like what you're paying to these large companies all the time. So yeah, I think we've already seen like the smaller versions of the models and like these, oh, it's an open source model of like for this very specific task. And I think we're just going to keep seeing like more and more of these models, and then the evaluations are going to be based on alignment. Because if you can get a similar alignment with these smaller free models that you have control over, I think it's going
Hmm.
to be like kind of disruptive in the space. But right now, third-party LLMs and OpenAI, Anthropic, like they're very much beating what's available open source for now.
Totally.
All right. So I see some users, some Phoenix users that are actually in the audience. Um, so Phoenix is Rise's open source solution for AI observability. Essentially, if you're using LLM callback systems like Llama Index, like LangChain, if you're building any LLM application system, every time you interact with an LLM, each interaction is documented in a callback system by a trace. And so you can send all those traces to Phoenix and it can collect all that information. And we also have released projects where you can divide up essentially each aspect of that LLM application and be able to look at it for projects. But I wanted to go through an example of taking this trustworthy LLM paper and seeing like, can we, say you have any research paper essentially, and you want to build a RAG system on it. So we've seen examples of, okay, I can take this paper and I could build like a Q&A system on it, right? And I could start interacting with it. But what if you wanted that system more aligned and you actually wanted to be able to see like, wait, are the answers that I'm getting, are they like hallucinated? Are they good? Can I get explanations for it? And can I also easily get like the reference material that generated this question answer pairing and look at like the evaluation? So this example is based off of uh, Arise and Ragus like did a recent event, and it was really nice using Ragus, which is an open source framework for RAG applications specifically. And so in this tutorial, like I'm not gonna run the whole thing, but this is available on our Phoenix documentation. So if you look at RAG use cases, if you have a RAG use case, you can use this notebook from our Phoenix documentation, and you can get a better understanding of tracing, of evaluations. We just have about 5 minutes. So essentially, like you can load in whatever document you would like. And then you can implement Ragas, implement either Llama Index or LangChain, because you do need kind of an orchestration system for actually building that LLM application. And then what's really nice with Ragas is that it will generate the question, the answer, and the context. You can also select if you want like a simple zero shot kind of effort on this generating of question answer pairs, or you can make it more of a reasoning, so a little bit more sophisticated that uses more of a chain of thought prompting. But essentially, what you can build by leveraging these different open source tools. I did use OpenAI for my LLM. I used GPT-4, but you can use whichever LLM that you'd want. And the way that this would show up in Phoenix, if you want to use the Phoenix UI, you can still use the notebook. But if you want to use the Phoenix UI, it will break up the creation of that test set. So the test data set that's going to be, all right, I'm giving it this document. Ragus is going to give me the questions, the answers, and the relevant content that created those. You can also use, Sally Ann mentioned, we have pre-tested evals in Phoenix, like ones like hallucination, toxicity. We're adding more and more every day, or you can make a custom one, or you can import evals from a second library, like Ragus does have its own evals. And once you have all that information, you can send it into a project in Phoenix where now you have your LLM system essentially documented. And this is the AI observability component. And yeah, this is essentially like gaining alignment on a RAG system that's based on alignment. So it's a little meta in the alignment on alignment side, but figure like, why not just show how to do this? Because when teams ask, oh, how do we know that this LLM is working? It's not so much about latency and token count and cost anymore. Now we're actually looking at performance and not just, oh, like, did they end up purchasing the product, yes or no? But do we have correctness? Do we have something like faithfulness? And this can be, you can have your own fairness and bias ones. I just ran Butker's Harrison Butker's the speech
Yep.
and an LLM, made the evaluations for misogynistic and like homophobic evals just based on a very objective prompt that a different LLM made. So the LLM made the prompt of the evaluations, and it's just very interesting to see kind of the breakdown. And you can add any additional evals that you want. And what's nice is you don't even have to create them yourselves. You can have an LLM create them and an LLM evaluate them. I know, Sally Ann, like you're in the process of working with Copilot and working with LLMs that evaluate LLMs that create content to train LLMs. And so, yeah, it can get a little bit in the weeds and a little bit meta, but I think that's why using models that are already aligned to do a lot of these tasks is
Exactly.
a really good argument for like why it works.
Totally. Yeah, I think evaluations really at this point are like our best tool when it comes to improving LLMs. You have so many options, like you were mentioning, there's so many ways to get you started without having to do any of the work. And then you can really start defining those custom evals when it becomes appropriate. And this is just really what's going to give you insights on your model to actually make better experiences for the user, drive business, all of those important things. So yeah, we've got some exciting stuff in the works on our side for evals, but excited to see more and more papers. Parna and I did one a few weeks ago about kind of this eval framework of being able to generate labels. And I just think there's a lot being invested in this, and there's a reason for that. And it's because they're so powerful for assessing LLMs.
We do have a few Colab notebooks as well if people are interested on creating that golden data set, having it labeled, having the explanations in place. And then when you put it into Phoenix, you can look at each trace, which is each execution of an LLM. You can look at like the input, like, oh, how do LLMs show their understanding of deriving the causal relationships from blah, blah, blah. And like this was in the paper, the output. And so anything can generate these inputs and outputs like for question answering pairs. But the fun thing is like being able to look at evaluation scores that you control yourself and being able to look at the full like retrieved documents that are responsible for answering this, as well as an explanation for um, why this response is a good response based on that content. So really, there's a lot you can do with the power of LLMs, and it's really fun to see where this field is going in general.
Absolutely. Well, we're just at time. We appreciate y'all for joining us. Wait, I think there might be one question. Maybe we can hit it quickly. So this question here is, as you know, culture, political norms, consensus changes, what is the best mechanism to keep foundational LLMs updated? Would that be updating evals, updating RAG docs, and finally retraining? My take on this is it's probably going to be a little bit of everything. You know, the LLM engine providers, they're going to keep releasing new models. They're going to be a little bit more up to date than the last one. So that will help us there. You know, updating evals is definitely important. You're going to want to iterate on those. Your requirements, your alignment requirements might change over time. So you're definitely going to want to, you know, update your evals accordingly. Keep your knowledge base up to date. I really do think it's probably a combination of all of this until, you know, I think the inevitable where these LLMs probably become real time in their knowledge. But yeah, that's my take. Amber, um, any any questions on that?
Yeah, because I think with us, and that's the thing with these companies that are the foundational LLM companies, you're not going to be able to update those yourselves or even know exactly what went into
Mhm.
them. So the companies will continue to have these really large models that they're training themselves and that any company that's leveraging them will not be retraining. But having a system like Phoenix really helps surface up those areas. When you say like, oh, should I update the RAG documents that are being used? Like, should I update like the material or generate more material? That a lot is shown in retrieval evals. So
Mhm.
am I getting a hit? Am I getting different parts? Like, am I having good retrieval evaluations? Because if you're not having good retrieval evaluations, you're probably not having good response
Totally.
evaluations from your LLMs.
Mhm.
So I would say, implement an AI observability system, and then anytime you get an indicator of something going wrong for those evals, then that's when you start troubleshooting. Because it's the same with any like personalization recommendation systems that you get.
Mhm.
They can start becoming very annoying to the user, or like recommending the same thing or recommending things they already bought or don't need. And what you have to do as the engineer is figure out, how do I adjust this? And so as more problems come up, like you'll get more solutions.
So that's a good point. That evals can be your signal for when you need to do those things. There's one more question. I think this will be a quick one. They're asking if we're afraid for LMs to be like overcorrectness or overcorrected and become Disneyfied. I think that means just that kind of going back to that like over censoring of things. I'm not personally really worried about this. I think that the teams at these LM providers dedicated are really doing a great job at kind of towing that line of what is, you know, misuse and what's not. And I don't think that we'll see them get to a place where they would essentially become, you know, useless if they went too far.
Yeah.
But yeah, your thoughts,
Yeah.
Amber?
I'm not worried about the same, Sally Ann, but I'm not worried about LLMs at all, because it's really the prompt that it's doing. And
Yeah,
if you make a like LLMs uh aren't going to make mistakes by like making up an additional like step to take if it's already defined in the prompt. Like they might hallucinate and like have a different interpretation of that prompt, but like them being there's so much testing and Sally, and like the red teaming you mentioned going on at these companies. LMs always like err on the side of caution, and that's that alignment aspect that we were talking about.
yeah,
And so yeah, I'm not worried if there is kind of overdone. It's probably traced back to the actual prompt that was put in by an engineer. And so then that would just be
totally.
changed.
That's a great call out. Awesome. Well, I think that's it. I know we're a little bit over. Thanks everyone for sticking with us here and joining us. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.